Hello, I'm Joseph Michelli, psychologist and organizational consultant with my second and final 2021 coping video. In my prior update video, I highlighted some of the key coping skills presented in the video series shared at the start of the pandemic. In this installment, we'll look at lessons learned throughout the pandemic and a couple of coping skills that are most relevant to this late stage in the crisis. During the past year, I spoke with more than 140 leaders about how they coped and what they learned as they positioned their companies to emerge from the pandemic stronger through adversity. Those conversations resulted in a book that was released by McGraw-Hill at the end of 2020. Leaders who participated in the book included CEOs and presidents of Microsoft, Marriott, Mercedes-Benz, and Target. The book also includes input from Elevation's president and CEO, Jerry Agnes. For the purposes of this video, I will highlight two coping lessons from Stronger Through Adversity: trust of the terrain and authenticity wins. I'll then conclude with two coping skills needed at this time in the pandemic, a tool to counteract coping fatigue and a guide to lasting impact. Let's start with trust the terrain. When our plans or the roadmap of our life differs from the terrain that's popping up in front of us, we need to trust the terrain. To understand what is happening around us when our plans are no longer relevant, it pays to heed the wisdom of first century philosopher Epictetus when he observed that we have two ears and one mouth so that we can listen twice as much as we speak. And during times of chaos, uncertainty, and tumult, the people around us have a greater need to be heard and seen. And their input helps us effectively navigate our lives and requires an increase in our effort to actively listen. That means we must be able to repeat back what we've heard and demonstrate empathy by asking people how they are feeling. In this past year, we saw a rise in empathic listening and compassionate behavior because we needed to pay attention to what we were hearing and observing in the lives of those around us. The second lesson is that authenticity wins. Throughout 2020, most of us experienced the gift of transparency. Before the pandemic, many leaders conducted business from their boardrooms. Throughout the crisis, many participated in video conferences from their bedrooms. Increasingly, we got a deeper view into the lives of our leaders and our teammates. While we can overdo personal disclosure at work, the pandemic showed most of us that we were underdoing it. As such, I'd like you to think about if and how you forged closer relationships during the pandemic. Moreover, I hope you'll take a look at the importance of appropriate self-disclosure as a way of acknowledging your strengths, your weaknesses, your talents, and your vulnerabilities. On to two coping skills targeted to this unique part of the crisis. The first is to recognize the normalcy bias and coping fatigue. The second is to think about your post-pandemic legacy. As much as we may not want to admit it, human beings act in predictably irrational ways. One of those irrational distortions is referred to as optimism bias. My mother would have called it wishful thinking. Crises bring out a unique form of optimism bias, which researchers call a normalcy or normality bias. This tendency underestimates the likelihood of a disaster and potential adverse impact when one occurs. Amid pandemics or natural disasters, studies have shown about 70% of people display varying degrees of normalcy bias. We want to assume that disasters won't happen to us, and if they do, we want to believe the consequences will be mild, and we also overestimate the speed and degree to which our lives will return to a pre-crisis state. So what can you do? The adage, hope for the best and plan for the worst, applies, but I modify that adage a bit to say maintain an optimistic attitude, but behave a little more cautiously than the best case scenario would predict. That approach is less tiring than taking a worst case mindset or being tripped up because you let your guard down, believing no harm could come to you. So here's the final coping tip. Think about the legacy your pandemic and post-pandemic behavior will leave. Crises reveal our character. Your actions during the pandemic and in the post-pandemic phase will largely contribute to how people will remember you. It's essential to define your desired lasting impact so you consciously can live into that aspiration. We will leave a legacy. For some, that legacy will happen by design, and for others, it will happen by default. Impact is greatest for those who define their desired outcome and take action to make it a reality, especially in a crisis. Thank you for the gift of your attention. It is my sincere hope that you emerge from this pandemic stronger through adversity.